Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back in New York. I was last here in 2014, together with Martin Lee. And the two of us were trying to draw attention to some of the specific concerns we have regarding the implementation of one country, two systems. Well, 3 years down the road, I wish on this occasion I had more encouraging news to give you about the health of one country, two systems. But alas, that is not to be. I remember Tom referred to the handover ceremony when I was in the foreground, standing between the British delegation and the Chinese delegation. And what was running through my mind at that time was, here we have the Joint Declaration and the Hong Kong's mini-constitution, the Basic Law, that was drafted very much on the foundations laid down in an internationally binding treaty, the Joint Declaration. And whilst we all had doubts about whether Beijing would keep to its promises, at least the signs were good. And I can say that in the 4 years that I remained as Chief Secretary after the handover, Beijing was scrupulous in observing the promises that they had made to the people of Hong Kong, which is that as a special administrative region of China, Hong Kong will enjoy a high degree of autonomy. It will have its own separate capitalist system. The socialist system on the mainland will not apply. And other than foreign affairs and defense, Hong Kong will enjoy a high degree of autonomy. Well, this year we're celebrating the 21st anniversary of Hong Kong's handover to China. And where do we stand as regards one country, two systems? If you measure one country, two systems by the usual yardsticks, which is the rule of law, basic rights and freedoms, particularly freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, and basic rights and freedoms. I am sorry to say that all of these are under pressure. Now, at the moment, the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law, generally speaking, still work well. But there are increasingly worrying signs that cracks are beginning to appear. In 2014, the State Council in Beijing issued a white paper, ostensibly on the implementation of the Joint Declaration and One Country, Two Systems and the Basic Law, in which, and I quote, it stated that Beijing has comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong, that members of the judiciary are part of the administration and therefore have to have regard in their judgments in courts to national security and development interests. Now, this is completely at odds with the separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary. And in the ensuing years since 2014, Beijing is making increasingly clear that what little autonomy Hong Kong enjoys is for Beijing to decide and to take away at will. The reason why I say the rule of law and the independence judiciary is coming under threat is we've had successive interpretations by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. So much so that there's a general perception in Hong Kong that when Beijing does not like a judgment handed down by our local courts, it will not hesitate to resort to interpretations. And the last one it handed down actually preempted judgment by the local courts, which was at that time considering the issue, and which resulted in an interpretation on how oath-taking, when swearing in members of the legislature, should be delivered. Who is sincere, who is not sincere, and who is to be believed and not believed. And we've seen, the latest we have seen of this sort of, political vetting is in the electoral office deciding to disqualify a candidate who wanted to stand for election in the by-election that is coming up in March to replace 3 of the ousted Pan-Democratic members from our legislature. Let's look at press freedom. I think today in Hong Kong, there is probably just one local newspaper that is still relatively independent. Now, self-censorship has always been a bit of a problem in Hong Kong in recent years. But we not only see increasing signs of self-censorship, but we see the representative central government office, that is the liaison office, muscling in and thinking nothing about, quote, inducing advertisers to lift advertisements, for example, from Apple Daily. Now, Apple Daily, as you all know, is owned by Jimmy Lai, and he's surviving simply because he has deep pockets. But if you continue to starve him of his main source of income, which is advertising, even he will not last very long. We've seen editors, reporters who don't toe the line suddenly being removed from their office. And in recent years, there's been at least 2 vicious attacks against journalists who do not toe the line. If you look at the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, we have fallen from a position of number 18 shortly after the handover to number 73. Look at academic freedom. You've probably all read about the fiasco and the controversy we had at Hong Kong University, my alma mater, in which a member of my think tank, who happens also to be the teacher of Mr. Benny Tai, one of the main architects of the Occupy Central movement, was denied a post that the university's own selection committee had unanimously approved for him to hold the pro-vice-chancellor post. As an illustration of how the Communist Party machinery actually works in Hong Kong, you will be surprised to learn that within the span of 3 months, the left-wing press mounted a smear campaign against Anson Chan, writing something like nearly 400 articles, completely without foundation, and maligning an academic who is really a very, very moderate person and hardly somebody that Beijing should be scared of. We now have on, whether in the capacity of vice-chancellor or on the important boards of universities, all 9 universities, increasing numbers of pro-Beijing supporters. So I'm afraid I'm not very sanguine about how long we will continue to see academic freedom and institutional autonomy in our universities. The Vice-Chancellor of Hong Kong University recently left his post a year ahead of his contract expiry date, and in an interview he gave shortly before he left, he referred to how much pressure he came under and the fact that almost every day he received instructions or advice from the liaison office. This is directly contrary to a specific article in our basic law, which says that no central government organ stationed in Hong Kong may interfere in the internal administration of Hong Kong. And finally, the way that the government has chosen to deal with young activists, the imprisonment of people like Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, and Alex Chow. And it appears to Hong Kong people that not only is our own government and Beijing intent on punishing these young activists, but they are also making it increasingly impossible for them to participate at all in the political process. Because if they're disqualified or if some of them are sued to repay allowances that have been legitimately paid to them when they were still performing their duties as a member of the legislature, and it results in bankruptcy, then that would shut them out of the political scene for the next 5 years. So let me conclude with this remark. We in Hong Kong feel that we are the solitary beacon in the entire PRC, the only Chinese city where respect for the maintenance of the rule of law and basic rights and freedoms are guaranteed not just by international treaty, but by our own constitution. And we badly need our friends around the world, we certainly need our American friends, to continue to actively encourage and support Hong Kong in its fight to keep its core values, its lifestyle, and its rule of law. Because without these attributes, I can assure you Hong Kong will be very, very quickly marginalized by the mainland. Thank you very much.
Anson, thank you very much for those eloquent and powerful remarks. I thought we might start our conversation before we go to take questions from the audience here and around the world, and to those of you in Hong Kong, good evening, with a effort by me to get your broader description of Hong Kong and what it means to the world. I think many in the audience are very aware of the unique role of Hong Kong that you just mentioned at the end of your discussion, but I wanted to try to elicit from you a bit more perspective, and if you'll indulge me, I'll start with an anecdote, which was in the 90s, right around the handover. I was asked to moderate a session like this by the World Economic Forum, where the person I was moderating was the foreign trade minister of North Korea. Now, first of all, I didn't know there was a foreign trade minister of North Korea. But his handlers asked me to get to the Hong Kong Convention Center a couple of hours before the session began, and I had a lot of time to kill with the foreign trade minister of North Korea. So I gave a half-hour discussion of my perspective of this unbelievable city that he was in for the first time. I talked about the barren rock, how the only natural resources were the port and the people and the rule of law and free press and entrepreneurial immigrants. And he listened, and then he and his translator went off in the corner and yelled at each other. And the translator came back and said to me, the foreign trade minister thanks you for your comments. He wants you to know he doesn't believe a word of it. So you came to Hong Kong, I believe, as a young girl.
Yes.
And so you have seen and lived through and participated in the modern Hong Kong, the making of this place. So tell us a little bit about what would have surprised the young Anson Chan about what Hong Kong has become.
Well, I think what would have surprised me, first of all, particularly given my experience in the 4 years after the handover, is the extent and the rapidity with which we're seeing the entire structure of one country, two systems being steadily eroded, and the basic rights and freedoms that are associated with it. I've been very surprised that even today, 21 years after the handover, there seems to be either a conscious or unconscious ignorance about exactly what role Hong Kong plays. Now, I know these days there is a tendency to dismiss Hong Kong as an entity that you really don't need to bother with the burgeoning and the increasing economic and geopolitical cloud of China as a whole. It is a fact that at the handover, Hong Kong's contribution to mainland's GDP was something like 18%. It's now down to 3%. But I think it's very simplistic to look at Hong Kong's contribution purely on the basis of size. It's never really been about size. For many decades, Hong Kong has been able to punch above its weight and to be an economic force in its own right by virtue of these, if you like, the soft infrastructure that we have. For example, our well-regulated financial regime, the role that we play as a place for doing business, for raising equity, for putting finance deals together. Why do foreigners bother to come to Hong Kong? Why do they bother to set up their headquarters in Hong Kong? It is precisely because we have the rule of law, independence of the judiciary, a fair, open legal system where contractual disputes can be settled fairly. Okay? And that role has not diminished. America and other countries have an interest in seeing one country, two systems succeed, not just for the benefit of the 7.3 million people who live in Hong Kong, but also very much in their own interest. As Senator Mark Rubio has pointed out in his bill on Hong Kong democracy and human rights, you have something like 60,000 Americans living in Hong Kong. You have 14,000 American businesses having offices in Hong Kong. And we have a strategic partnership with America that both sides treasure because both sides benefit from that setup. And what we need desperately at the moment is for America to continue to remind China this is the role that Hong Kong plays. You forcibly erode and remove the infrastructure that is Hong Kong's basic strength and the bedrock of our success so far, then you ensure that Hong Kong will be very, very quickly marginalized, because there is no other way in which we can compete with Chinese cities.
You mentioned the Sino-British Joint Declaration in your comments. This past summer, the Foreign Ministry in Beijing, I think, referred to that as an historical document that no longer has practical significance, words to that effect. Remind us about the Joint Declaration, its status as a legal document with obligations.
Well, the Joint Declaration was ratified by both China and the United Kingdom in 1984. And it served as the basis for the subsequent drafting and promulgation of Hong Kong's mini-constitution, which is the basic law. And in it, although it does not, for example, mention specifically a timetable for universal suffrage, it spells out in what way Hong Kong should be different from mainland China, and it holds out the hope that Hong Kong will progressively move towards genuine universal suffrage, one man, one vote, not the sort of version that Beijing would like to impose on Hong Kong. Both sides put their signature to this document, and it was on this basis that China welcomed and indeed actively solicited the support of the international community to support Hong Kong's handover on this basis. So it is, in my view, a bit ridiculous for mainland Chinese officials today to claim that anybody who speaks up about the erosion of one country, two systems and the chipping away of Hong Kong's lifestyle and core values is somehow foreign interference. It is nothing of the sort. Because of your own interest in Hong Kong, you have a legitimate right to be concerned and to ensure that Beijing keeps to its promises. Because if it can walk away with impunity on its international treaty obligations to Hong Kong, then I think the rest of the world should be worried about China's commitment to all its other international treaty obligations, to your country and to the European Union countries, to the UK, etc., etc.
The British Foreign Office, I guess to its credit, immediately said it remains a legally binding document with legal and moral commitments.
Well, I was in London at that very point in time when the Chinese official came out to say that the Joint Declaration is a historical document that no longer has any relevance. And I saw the Minister of State for Asia Affairs, Mark Field, and I made this point. I said, really, it is high time that Britain takes seriously its legal and moral obligation to Hong Kong to ensure that China deliver on its promises. I want to make this statement, that is, that the Joint Declaration, as its name implies, is a joint declaration. It is not a Chinese declaration. It was solemnly signed by both the United Kingdom and by China. And the United Kingdom owes Hong Kong people the legal and moral obligation to speak up and ensure that China sticks to its word. So, better late than never. And I think that has only come about as a result of a number of public slaps in the face that Beijing delivered to British officials and non-officials. For example, the refusal to allow a human rights activist, Ben Rogers, to enter Hong Kong, even though under our basic law, we are supposed to have total control over our immigration policies.
How would you rate the effectiveness of the British government in this regard?
Great Britain likes to tell us that, oh, there's very little that we can do. But I'm not saying that speaking out necessarily immediately gets you the desired result. But I do know for a fact that Beijing cares about its international image. You certainly achieve nothing by sitting back and doing nothing and giving Beijing the impression that money talks loudest, and they can walk away from their commitments. Britain should use this opportunity to take a different stance, maybe from the rest of the European Union, by articulating firmly and consistently their own core values, which they imparted to Hong Kong people, and to impress upon China why it is important to stick to these promises, both for Hong Kong's sake, for Beijing's sake, but also for the rest of the world.
Let's turn perhaps to Hong Kong itself. At that handover event in 1997, you were, of course, aware that the chief executive had been selected by Beijing, would be selected by Beijing for some time. How would you rate the performance of the various chief executives? And
first of all, the last election, the so-called election of our chief executive, was certainly not a free election. And this time, Beijing, and particularly the liaison office in Hong Kong, didn't even bother to maintain the fig leaf that it was a free election. It was an open secret that the liaison office had muscled in and twisted arms so that some people who originally supported the other contender, our previous financial secretary, John Tsang, was made to change their vote to support Kerry. We all had high hopes that Kerry, admittedly, she's in a difficult position. She's between a rock and a hard place. But that she would use every opportunity to demonstrate to Hong Kong people that she understands our fears and concerns, that she is prepared to help us defend one country, two systems, and to do battle on Hong Kong's behalf. I have always believed, and I believe this to this day, that the envelope, the framework of one country, two systems is not written in tablets of stone. And it seemed to me so important, at least in the initial years after the handover, for whoever is the chief executive, to try and see how far this envelope will stretch. Now, I am not saying that every battle you choose to do with Beijing on Hong Kong's behalf will necessarily succeed, but you won't know until you try. And at least you will be seen in the eyes of the Hong Kong people that you are our chief executive and not just Beijing's chief executive in Hong Kong. Our young people particularly are so disenchanted and so disillusioned with the behavior and the actions of this SAR government, even in the few short months that Mrs. Carrie Lam has been imposed. But maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe we should give her a bit more time. I entirely understand she has to enlist the trust and support of Beijing. But she has quickly, sooner rather than later, to demonstrate to Hong Kong people that she is on our side.
You remain, of course, a very well-informed person in Hong Kong. Are there examples of chief executives trying to push the envelope to test how far that envelope could go?
No, on the contrary. There has been, in my view, at least one or two opportunities for Mrs. Carrie Lam to demonstrate that. But perhaps she's far too conscious of the need to, at the moment, earn the absolute trust of Beijing before she attempts to stick her neck out a bit insofar as one country, two systems, high degree of autonomy is concerned. So we'll wait and see.
You've mentioned a couple of times the attitude of younger people in Hong Kong, and there's, of course, the case of Joshua Wong. Martin Lee, the former legislator, wrote earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, he described Joshua Wong as Hong Kong's youngest political prisoner. There are surveys of young people in Hong Kong that seem to indicate that they have a much different attitude toward being Hong Kong people and toward the mainland than their parents had.
I know that Beijing often complains that 21 years after the handover, the hearts and minds of Hong Kong people, particularly young people, have not returned to the motherland. What they fail to understand is that the younger generation in Hong Kong regards, themselves as having a totally separate identity. First of all, they identify themselves as Hong Kongers. That doesn't mean that they're unpatriotic. That doesn't mean that they do not accept that Hong Kong is a part of China. What it does mean is that Hong Kong was promised a separate system. We were promised that our core values that revolves around being open, being tolerant, respecting human dignity, respect for the rule of law, all those would remain intact, that we would keep our culture. For example, why do we find so much disagreement with even something like requiring students at one of our university to pass a compulsory test in Putonghua? It's not so much that they object to having to learn Putonghua, but it is in the minds of these young people, Putonghua stands for everything they do not like about how mainlanders behave, how mainland officials behave towards its own people. So it's very important for us to keep this separate identity. And at the end of the day, to put it very starkly, it seems that we're moving to a situation where Beijing is telling Hong Kong people, as part of one country, and Hong Kong is an inalienable part of China, and you can only support the basic law and be loyal to the Constitution if you embrace the Communist Party. This wasn't what Hong Kong people were led to believe. I remember at the time when considerable concern was expressed about whether returning Hong Kong to the motherland meant that we had to embrace lock, stock, and barrel communist ideology and dogma. And Deng Xiaoping said very clearly, loving the country does not mean you have to love the Communist Party, so long as you accept the return of sovereignty, and we work strictly on the basis of one country, two systems. But now we're being told that if somehow you speak out against the Communist Party and everything it stands for, then you're unpatriotic, you're deemed unqualified to stand for election. This goes against Hong Kong's basic, human rights bill, which states that every citizen in Hong Kong shall have the right to stand for election without unnecessary restrictions. So why are we introducing political screening into deciding the eligibility of people to stand for election?
So another anecdote, Milton Friedman, the great free market economist, came to Hong Kong many times, and on one of those trips, he gave a press conference, and after the press conference, there was a line, a queue of Hong Kong reporters seeking his autograph. So Hong Kong is a very different place. I asked Professor Friedman to list all the places where he gave press conferences where reporters asked for his autograph, and he said it was a list of one place.
Well, I mean, we're not asking for anything that has not been promised to Hong Kong people in our own constitution, the basic law, because we believe that that is the best way in which Hong Kong can serve our motherland, not otherwise.
Let's talk a little bit more about the younger generation. I think we saw with the Occupy Central movement, the reaction against the change in the school curriculum. You've given the example of the Putonghua requirement. That seems a dangerous development.
Yes. I have to say I have great admiration for our younger generation, particularly people like Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, Alex Chow, and many others, for the courage that they have demonstrated in standing up and being counted. And they do so at considerable personal sacrifice. In the case of Joshua Wong, if he was graduating tomorrow and he was looking for a job in Hong Kong, I can assure you he will get very, very few offers. Even from amongst employers who are Democrats at heart. So many of them are so afraid of being seen to be stepping out of line, believing wrongly, in my view, that their best interests lie in getting on the good side of mainland officials and keeping their heads low. My experience is that appeasement and capitulation do not work. If we believe in our own values and we believe in the efficacy of one country, two systems, then all of us must have the courage to stand up and be counted. And I place my hope for the future of Hong Kong in our younger generation. They will not be cowed.
So remind us, if you would, of the election of some Democrats into the Legislative Council, the issue you referred to in your opening remarks about the legal interpretation of the oath and whether the person actually believes the oath, and then the most recent case of someone banned from running because of beliefs, yes. I suppose.
Well, 6 pan-democratic LegCo members have now been ousted from the Legislative Council ostensibly because they made a mockery of their oath-taking in the Legislative Council. Now, there may not be much public sympathy for at least 2 of them, but the other 4, okay, they attempted to introduce some extraneous words and whatnot, but you could hardly say it. And in fact, a few of them were given the chance by the president of the Legislative Council to take their oath again, only for that to be taken away because of the interpretation by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. So far, the government, the SAR government, and Beijing have deprived some 28 people either of their right to serve as members of the legislature or to stand for election. And I do not know how many more will follow. So it's not a good sign. With the ousting of these 6 members, the pan-democratic camp has lost its much-needed power of veto, so that experience has indicated they have been able to drive through unpalatable changes to the rules of procedure in our legislature. And with the specter of Article 23 on national security and defining offenses such as subversion, secession, and treason on the horizon, who knows? Maybe the government will take the opportunity created by the fact that the pro-Beijing party is now the largest party in our legislature and can more or less, with government support, get most of the unpalatable things they want through our legislature. Relationship between the executive and the legislature remain as fractious as ever. Carrie Lam came to her post promising to unite, but at the moment it seems that she's doing more to divide rather than unite. And we badly need the rift in society to be healed, but it can only be healed if Beijing allows Carrie some latitude in administering Hong Kong. Carrie may think that concentrating on social, economic issues, livelihood issues such as affordability of housing will get her over the worst of her troubles. I don't think so. And for as long as the chief executive and her team lacks the political mandate to govern, because they are not popularly elected, then this government will always have difficulty in getting its programs and its legislative proposals through a very fractious legislature.
I think historically, when it came to political institutions in Hong Kong, the Legislative Council was viewed by many Hong Kong people as the most legitimate, perhaps, along with the civil service. Is that changing in Hong Kong because of these adjustments?
Yes. First of all, the very behavior of certain members of the legislature have not gone down well with the general public, resort to, for example, filibustering. But then you have to understand why this has come about. It's also come about because this government doesn't listen. The pan-democrat members, even though they enjoy 60% of the popular vote, nevertheless, time and again find that their proposals are defeated by a small vested interest group inside the legislature who are returned to our legislature through these what I call rotten boroughs, which is functional constituencies, where the constituency is only about 226 voters against 3.3 million voters on the geographical. So time again, they're able to defeat the wishes of the general public. And if you want to get government programs through, you somehow have to heal this rift. And you have to make a move on restarting negotiations on universal suffrage and one man, one vote. At the moment, the government says it is not going to reopen this discussion anytime soon. Well, I hope that Carrie will change her mind.
So you mentioned the media in your opening comments as well. Hong Kong still has many news organizations, more newspapers, I think, than any place else, perhaps in the world. Several of them racing newspapers, but still. But you also suggested in your remarks that there are very few that you would consider.
Yeah, I think insofar as the local press is concerned, that's the situation. But fortunately, the international press is still by and large alive and well in Hong Kong. And the growth of the digital media means that the chief editors of the printed media no longer have sole jurisdiction over what will be printed or not printed, because you can be sure that if a story runs on the digital side, even the printed press will be forced to follow suit. So, and again, I think this is an illustration of how, to some extent, the foreign community in Hong Kong is insulated from these sort of effects that the local people feel. So they're none the wiser about what exactly has happened to the state of the local, at least the local printed press.
So you mentioned Apple Daily. Are there other local?
Very precious few. I think, in my view, most of the other local newspapers are mouthpieces of the government to a greater or lesser extent. And as for our free-to-air television, I think they are entirely in the pockets of the SAR government and Beijing and the liaison office.
So let's perhaps turn now to what others can do about the situation you've described in Hong Kong and particularly the United States. My perception, anyway, is that the United States has not been particularly active in recent years, and I wonder if that's accurate and what your forecast is.
Yeah, well, at least I see that some members of Congress take an interest in what's going on. There is the Mark Rubio bill. What we need, I think, is for America, both at the governmental level and non-governmental level, to continue to shine a light on Hong Kong and to impress upon China that what matters, what happens in Hong Kong matters to America, to the European Union, to Great Britain, and to all the other countries who have a relationship with Hong Kong. I think also we need to disabuse Beijing of the, other countries of the view that they can only have a relationship, do trade, do business with China at the expense of keeping mum on their core values, human rights, etc., etc. That is not the case. Surely you can have a very fruitful engagement and relationship on the trade and economic side without sacrificing your own core values, which Hong Kong shares with you. And it's a particularly pertinent point because you are dealing with a China today that has increasing economic and geopolitical clout. And if you judge China's attitude from Xi Jinping's long speech at the 19th Party Congress, China feels the time has come for it to take a lead, that its model of economic growth, that is socialism with Chinese characteristics, whatever that means, is the model to sell to the rest of the world. The rest of the world has to ask itself, what sort of a China would they wish to deal with? Surely, the rest of the world would like to see a China that moves progressively towards a rules-based order that embraces certain universal values on human rights, basic dignity, and freedom. That is the sort of China that I would wish to see. There's a view that simply because we have the temerity to stand up and criticize, that somehow we are unpatriotic. I regard myself as every inch a patriotic Chinese, but it doesn't mean that I have to agree with everything that emanates from Beijing, particularly not the views and action of Beijing as regards implementation of one country, two systems, the rule of law, and basic rights and freedoms.
I think you're suggesting that there's a role for Hong Kong in what I think everyone understands to be a increasingly powerful China and tensions between China and other countries, including the U.S. Would you prefer that Hong Kong become more of a fulcrum in that?
I don't want Hong
balancing
Kong
act?
to find itself wedged, for example, between an all-out trade war. I think that there's no alternative but to continue to engage China. But I think the rules of engagement perhaps should be clearer on both sides.
Is there a specific policy recommendation that you have for the United States with regards to Hong Kong?
Let's look at, for example, the Marco Rubio bill. I'm not quite sure exactly where it stands in Congress now, but we welcome the interest that this bill demonstrates in Hong Kong's welfare and its adherence to the rule of law and the protection of basic rights and freedoms. But I think personally we would prefer to see a specific acknowledgement of solidarity with Hong Kong, because the bill as it is currently drafted gives the impression that somehow Hong Kong may be the instigator of destroying one country, two systems, whereas we are very much the victim. So maybe a specific acknowledgement or a sentence in that bill would do well. But we do welcome a focus on Hong Kong in Congress. For example, in the UK, there has recently been established a Hong Kong Watch, which in the words of one of the supporters, Lord Paddy Ashdown, will act as a sort of whistleblower, keep an eye on how one country, two systems is being implemented. So any amount of interest, genuine interest in what goes on in Hong Kong, and particularly the speaking up, both privately and publicly, is so essential, because if nothing else, I think we need to give our younger generation some hope that the rest of the world cares about what happens to this small little enclave of 7.3 million people. Because I cannot imagine, what Hong Kong's future would be like if you deprive our younger generation of that very essential hope.
So we'll go to questions shortly. So I see eager hands. We're going to go to questions now. So please. I think there's a microphone. Thank you very much.
Anson, it's very nice to see you here. As an American who lived for 15 years in Hong Kong and recently returned, it's very nice to see you on these shores.
Thank you.
You gave a very disturbing list of all of the ways that Hong Kong's promised autonomy is eroding. But one that you didn't mention that I think is important is the apparent kidnappings of quite a number of people. And notably, I know my Hong Kong friends were quite upset by that, but foreigners as well, precisely because while all of those who were taken had Chinese faces, they all had different passports. Mainland Chinese billionaire from the Four Seasons Hotel, somebody with a Canadian passport, and someone with Hong Kong papers taken not only from Hong Kong, but also apparently from Thailand and kept in mainland China. Could you talk about the implications of that?
Yes, I apologize, first of all, for the omission. I think the abduction of the booksellers, and in particular the abduction of Mr. Xiao Jianhua from the Four Seasons Hotel, is something that is deeply worrying to Hong Kong people. Because up until then, at least we thought in Hong Kong that we were safe in our own beds, and we do not have to fear, as it were, the midnight knock. But the forcible abduction of one Mr. Li Po, and also the way they dealt with a number of the booksellers who actually had foreign passports, a Swedish passport and also a British passport, has really caused great concern and consternation, not just amongst ordinary folks in Hong Kong, but amongst the business community, because it then became glaringly clear that we're not, after all, even safe on Hong Kong soil. Now, what I find particularly disappointing is that after a long hiatus, the best that our SAR government has been able to solicit from Beijing is an improved notification notice. But we were pressing the SAR government to seek an absolute guarantee from Beijing that this sort of thing would never be allowed to happen again. They failed to do this. And in the case of Xiao Qianhua, who was forcibly removed from the Four Seasons hotel on the eve of the last Chinese New Year, he has promptly disappeared and nothing has been heard from him. Did our SAR government, did our police, did our immigration authorities so much as murmur and said, hey, this is not on and we have to do something about it? No. This is yet another demonstration of how weak the SAR government, is. Now, if you give Beijing the impression that they can get away even with this sort of behavior, then you just encourage them to step even more on Hong Kong. And that's not the worst. I didn't mention also another thing that, if anything, is even worse, is that the SAR government has recently chosen to cede jurisdiction over a prime piece of Kowloon land, ostensibly in the name of traveling convenience to facilitate passengers taking the high-speed rail link that links Hong Kong with the rest of mainland China. Now, this is totally against the basic law. There is no legal basis for it, and yet it did not stop the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress pronouncing that this is inconsistent with the basic law and will promptly be implemented. Okay? It has prompted our Bar Association, which is a highly respected professional body in Hong Kong, coming out with a very strongly worded statement in which they said, first of all, that this is the most serious retrograde step in the implementation of the basic law, and that it severely undermines confidence in the rule of law and in the independence of the judiciary. So none of these things augur well insofar as Beijing's willingness to keep one country, two systems intact at least until 2047. And in earlier years, we at least harbored the thought that perhaps if Beijing kept to its promises and the SAR government held Beijing to its promises, that there was a possibility that one country, two systems would survive even beyond 2047. And this question is going to come up very soon, because we have land leases that straddle 30 years. And we're approaching that very rapidly. And people will be starting to ask, hey, what's going to happen after 2047?
I think Bobby was next.
Thank you. You mentioned that you said that you welcomed American congressional interest in Hong Kong. I wonder if I can get you to react to today's news that 12 American congressmen have written a letter to the Nobel Peace Committee recommending Joshua, Alex, and Nathan for the Nobel Peace Prize. Is that something you would welcome? And if you could give us a sense of how that might be received in Hong Kong and in Beijing.
Well, I think ultimately it is surely for the Nobel nomination committee to decide who is worthy of this Nobel Peace Prize, award. I can see why members of Congress feel that there should be some explicit recognition of the considerable courage that our young activists, Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, and Alex Chow, demonstrated in participating in not only in the umbrella movement, but in subsequently standing up to encroachments on one country, two systems. I have no doubt that it will not be well received by Beijing.
Sir.
Yes. Thank you for a very eloquent speech. The only as an overseas Chinese, the only thing that I've always felt strange is the assumption that Hong Kong's basic law would be upheld, given the fact that it never had that kind of democracy when the British were in control, and they only allowed that to happen when they were giving up, when all of the assets by Jardine were deployed to Bermuda. They've taken their loot and left, not allowing anybody from Hong Kong to enter Britain. So I don't see in your sense that basically Hong Kong was sold out to China by the British, and they have a long history of doing that. Why should it be so surprising that the mainland could allow Hong Kong to be more free than the British ever allowed it to be? That's question number one. Question number two is, how do you think that Hong Kong being a hop and a skip from the mainland be able to keep over 1 billion people not swimming to Hong Kong if it were to be a completely different country? Mm-hmm. And the third question is that...
can I take the first two? I will forget about, if it's a, three-pronged, yes. Let me deal with your first two questions. First of all, I am not an apologist for Great Britain and everything it did or did not do in Hong Kong. I'm sure if you ask a fair-minded British person today, if they had known what was going to happen, the Tiananmen incident, the ratification of the Joint Declaration, the promulgation of the Basic Law, and everything that has happened in the past 21 years, he or she possibly said, yes, we should have made an earlier move about introducing democracy in Hong Kong. Okay? But there's one essential difference that I must point out. Okay? Britain is a parliamentary democracy. And one of the two best legacies that they left to Hong Kong people was the rule of law and a truly independent judiciary. And most of the basic rights and freedoms that you would associate with a fully fledged democracy, minus one man, one vote. That is their legacy in Hong Kong, and that is the very foundation and the cornerstone of Hong Kong's success. Okay? It is also a fact, and this much became apparent in the official documents that were recently released after the usual embargo of 30 years or whatnot, in which correspondence between the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Beijing indicated that from time to time, even in the 60s and the 70s, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London attempted to introduce democracy and free elections in Hong Kong, only to be told by Beijing, including by Zhou Enlai, then Prime Minister, that under no circumstances will they tolerate a democratically elected Hong Kong, because they saw that as a first step towards independence for Hong Kong. And they made it clear that if Britain insisted nevertheless on going ahead, they do not rule out the possibility that they would take Hong Kong back by force. Now that, if you like, probably gave Britain, who at that time was certainly not very enthusiastic about introducing democracy, the ready-made excuse not to move on that front. But I dare say that if they could have anticipated what happened in 1989 with the Tiananmen incident, they arguably would have accepted they should have moved far quicker on introducing democracy in Hong Kong. Chris Patten attempted to do this by considerably enlarging the franchise, only for this to be completely annulled following the handover. Okay, so that is the picture. Now, we in Hong Kong, in my view, given the ratification of the Joint Declaration, an internationally binding treaty, given what is written in our basic law, and given the fact that it was on that basis Britain justified handing over 6 million Hong Kong people to a country that was still under one-party system rule. I don't see why we could not have expected Beijing to keep to its promises, because it wasn't just good for Hong Kong. It was the only way in which we could have made the unique contribution that we made to our motherland in the early days of open door policy. Several decades of phenomenal economic growth in mainland China, the whole economy in the Pearl River Delta region was kick-started by Hong Kong money, Hong Kong managerial know-how, and Hong Kong's financial expertise, and our open and well-regulated supervisory systems. So, is it too late to expect China to realize what exactly makes Hong Kong tick? Yes, I think it is more difficult now, because the China that we're dealing with today is not the China who negotiated the Joint Declaration and promulgated the Basic Law in the 70s and the 80s. China is now a country with growing economic clout and wanting to play its role on the world stage. And unfortunately, the rest of the world gives China the impression that money talks so loud that they can get away with anything, so long as you maintain trade and investments two-way. And I'm saying that the rest of the world should stop and think about what sort of a China you want to be dealing with in the longer term.
But Hong Kong came about that way because the British had power, gunpowder, and money.
Yes, I'm not excusing that.
And countries are famous for going back on their promises. We're fighting for our basic rights in this country. You know, if Trump had his way, we would have no freedom of speech. So I think that there's a level of innocence in Hong Kong of wanting to believe that it would work.
Well, maybe you will conclude that we were naive and simple.
Oh yes, I also do that.
Please.
Peggy Blumenthal from the Institute of International Education, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the role of the academic community globally could be and what universities should be doing. For one specific example, in 2 months we're going to be bringing 70 engineering schools from around the world to visit and have meetings in Hong Kong Poly and City University. And the question is, engage or not engage?
Engage. In Hong Kong, the general public greatly values academic freedom and institutional autonomy. And so what happened with the University of Hong Kong saga has really worried us. And there's every sign that the infiltration and the indoctrination and the propaganda machinery are being rolled out every day in all the tertiary institutions in Hong Kong, all 9 of them. The recent talk about how the SAR government should be strengthening national education, well, we all know what national education is designed to achieve, also has us very worried. And on that score, I think we just have to be on the alert. Fortunately, we have teachers, we have students who will keep a very, very close eye on how curriculum are drawn up and what sort of national education is being introduced into our primary and our secondary schools. You'll remember that several years ago, the government attempted to introduce what, in our view, was brainwashing propaganda material about national education. And it was Joshua Wong, who was at that time 15, who spearheaded a movement which eventually forced the SAR government to withdraw the entire package of revised school curriculum. But it is a front that we will need to continue to keep a watch out. But I think it's so important for the international community, particularly at university level, to also say what they treasure most in an academic institution that is supposed to open up people's minds and encourage people to think for themselves, to question and not to accept everything they are told as gospel truth. This is the ultimate objective of university education, and this message bears repeating time and time again, because as you know, this is not the way that they see it in mainland China. In fact, shortly after Xi Jinping came to power, he issued specific instructions to tertiary institutions that there are 7 no-go areas that cannot be taught in universities in the mainland. We do not want to see that imported into Hong Kong.
Young man here.
Hi, Ms. Chen, and thank you so much for your great talk. I'm Lincoln Lee, a researcher for China and the Hong Kong economy, and I have one question. Like in your speech, you mainly talk about like 2 parts, the Chinese central government and the Hong Kong people. But I want to know what's your ideas about the role, the local like business elite and tycoons, because from the research of the Hong Kong taxation and economic history, those groups, in my opinion, they are very good at using like political fight to maximum their like business like benefit. And I suspect that an intense like confrontation between the Chinese government and Hong Kong local people can help them to maximize their benefit, like prevent Hong Kong from transfer to like more like sustainable business model and move to a depeg like Hong Kong dollar from US dollar, which can help Hong Kong to like prevent further like economic crisis. So I would know your ideas.
Well, I'm sorry to say that by and large, our business elites and our business people in Hong Kong wrongly concludes that it is in their best interest to keep on the good side of Beijing and the liaison office by keeping their head low. Because it is a fact that the liaison office will not hesitate to point out to Hong Kong business people that if you do not toe the line, then it would be too bad for the prospects of you doing business, not only in mainland China, but increasingly in Hong Kong, as Chinese enterprises take over so many sectors of the economy. Okay? The foreign press somehow hesitate to speak out, at least publicly, although behind the scene, in the light of incidents, for example, the abduction of booksellers and this recent co-location arrangements on the high-speed rail link, they will speak up behind closed doors. But I encourage them to speak up more openly, at least to express their concerns directly to Beijing officials in Hong Kong, pointing out that if you take away the rule of law, and there's no longer freedom, like freedom of expression, free flow of information, and press freedom, then they will think twice about setting up their offices in Hong Kong. Why should they, if Hong Kong becomes just another Chinese city? They might just as well take their risk by going directly into China. Okay? I think that in the light of recent experiences, you see some of the chambers of commerce being more willing to speak up. But I encourage them all of them, to speak up, because they may accuse you of interfering in China's domestic affairs publicly, but privately behind the scene, they do take to heart how they are regarded by the foreign community in Hong Kong.
I think in the
Hi, Anson. Mike Forsyth from
Hi.
New York Times.
Hi, Mike.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
So I wanted to push you a little bit on the U.S. response. I mean, you were the head of the civil service in Hong Kong and not the foreign service, but I thought you would be very, very diplomatic talking about Marco Rubio and what he's doing. But what about the Trump administration itself? Could they be doing more? And have you been a little bit disappointed perhaps by the tone that the Trump administration has kind of conveyed to the world, his affinity for autocrats, in Egypt or Russia, Turkey, you name it. Has that maybe hurt the effort to raise?
Yes, I am disappointed. I wish that President Trump would be much more forthcoming and much more, firm about human rights. Human rights situation in China, support for basic freedoms, show a bit of interest in what goes on in Hong Kong, where you have your own nationals living and working in Hong Kong. I think that I certainly would not wish to see an all-out trade war between America and China, because that will not be good for either country, nor would it be good for Hong Kong, because we would be caught exactly in the middle, and it would not be good for the rest of the world. Okay? But I think China particularly listens to the United States. I know this for a fact behind the scene. They will never own up to this in public. So the message needs to be spoken, but it seems to be not very spoken these days, or at least in very muted tones. And the other thing we would like to see is more visits by members of Congress, more visits even by ordinary folks in Hong Kong, think tanks, educational institutions, people, simply to show interest, to espouse what makes Hong Kong the place that it is today, why Hong Kong has been able to punch above its weight all these several decades, despite the adversities that we suffer. Everything that matters to the rest of the world, you should impress upon mainland China. And you should point out to mainland China that all this does not mean that China is a threat to China's control over Hong Kong. But the best thing that China can do is to leave Hong Kong alone and let us get on with one country, two systems, a high degree of autonomy, and Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. It sometimes strikes me that the increasingly tight grip that Xi Jinping is exhibiting towards Hong Kong, is that somehow a sign of a lack of confidence in its own leadership? What do they have to fear from people like me, from 7.3 million people, or a much lesser number of that, who dare to speak up and say, hey, you're walking away and rewriting our basic law and the rules of the game?
In the front.
Thank you for a very illuminating conversation. I'm Nachi Das. I'm an entrepreneur in Asia and here in the US. Given that Hong Kong's success, and in fact its early contribution to the development of Chinese economy, stemmed largely from its open and international nature, what do you think China's endgame is by destroying its fundamental character? What does it want by making Hong Kong into another provincial Chinese city?
There are different schools of thought on this. One school of thought is that the leadership in Beijing has decided that they don't need Hong Kong. So, and in an effort to assert their total control over Hong Kong, they're prepared to destroy the very fundamentals that make Hong Kong what it is. I don't entirely subscribe to that view, because I think the Communist Party leadership is not a monolithic structure. I think there are still different voices, although it is very difficult because of the opaqueness of the system to decipher who are the moderate voice and who are the hardline voice. But there is no doubt that the hardline voice at the moment is in the ascendancy. And at the moment, with everything that's going on in the country as a whole, it is far better to be seen on the left than on the right. So nobody would dare to stick their neck out. But I do hear on the grapevine. For example, at the time when the State Council decided to issue this paper stressing comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong, there were actually some moderate voices in Beijing who warned that there would be a huge backlash in Hong Kong, as there was, because it led to 1,000 lawyers dressed in black taking to the streets and marching to the final appeal. I think there are different voices, but Xi Jinping seems intent on asserting absolute control and stressing the supremacy of the one-party system rule. Everything else is subordinate to that. Okay? I don't think that there is a well-thought-out plan to destroy Hong Kong as it is. But there is undoubtedly a feeling, and this comes back to a point I made earlier, the failure really to understand what makes Hong Kong tick. Because in the minds of the hardliners particularly, their view is somehow you can put long-term economic growth in a compartment totally separate from political liberalization. You and I know you can't. Okay? But that's their view. And they take a look, as somebody pointed out in an earlier question, well, the Brits didn't give Hong Kong, democracy and one man, one vote, and yet Hong Kong has thrived. So why is it under Chinese rule we cannot achieve the same? But what they fail to understand is what are the underlying principles that makes Hong Kong the entity that it is. So I don't think there's a fixed blueprint to destroy Hong Kong. And you may say it's a forlorn hope. What I'm hoping for is that maybe not in the short term, but in the maybe middle term future, things within China itself will change. Because I think the people themselves, whilst they may not for quite a while demand one man, one vote, they will demand more transparent and more accountable government.
Isn't that the fear?
The fear?
Isn't that the
that's certainly the fear of, I think, Xi Jinping, because he is intent on stressing the supremacy of the one-party system rule. And he is, making out that their model of development is the best and the most sustainable model.
So, question in the back.
Hi, thanks for this wonderful talk. I grew up in Hong Kong, and I was there for the umbrella protests. And China's heavy-handed response just sort of diminished pretty much all hope that a young Hong Konger would have. And you mentioned that the joint declaration is sort of not written in stone, and it can be pushed a little bit, and there's room for negotiation. If you were in Carrie Lam's shoes right now, what would you bring to the table to negotiate?
Well, the first thing I would do is to impress upon China that, for example, they have nothing to fear by giving Hong Kong people the right to vote for our own leaders, whether you're talking about the chief executive or all members of our legislature. On the contrary, it will give a political mandate to the chief executive and her team to govern, and that is bound to lead to more effective governance. One of the main gripes at the moment is the poor quality of governance. Not only is this government becoming less and less transparent, but it seems to be more and more leaning towards siding with Beijing and chipping away at our basic rights and freedoms and a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong people. I would certainly attempt to fight for all the freedoms and rights that are guaranteed to us. For example, do we still today enjoy the right under our immigration rules to decide who can or cannot enter Hong Kong? Is a British parliamentarian visiting Hong Kong foreign interference? Even though Britain has this legal and moral obligation under the Joint Declaration to see implementation of one country, two systems. Yes, she needs to start a dialogue with mainland officials, and she needs to be seen out there to be doing the battle and not allowing the liaison office to walk all over Hong Kong. The liaison office in recent years, particularly under the 5 years of Mr. C.Y. Leung, has become so blatant and so open in its infringement into Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy. And it increasingly makes no secret of the fact that they interfere left, right, and center. For example, it is an open secret that in the last election, whether it was the election to members of our legislature or the election of the chief executive, the liaison office paid money as inducements, sent truck loads of people to ferry former Hong Kong residents from across the border to come and vote, and furthermore tells these people who to vote for and who not to vote for. And yet, despite our protests and whatnot, the government pays it no heed, and we don't seem to be able to do anything to stop this sort of blatant interference. There are small little steps that Carrie can take without, hopefully, raising suspicion or concern on the part of mainland Chinese officials. But she needs sooner rather than later to be seen doing this in the eyes of Hong Kong people. Otherwise, I dare say that the remaining 4 years of her term will be increasingly fraught with difficulties, particularly if she refuses to allow reopening of the discussion on how we achieve one man, one vote. Nobody in Hong Kong is asking for the sun and the moon, and we're not expecting to be able to achieve one man, one vote overnight. But what we are hoping, and indeed my little think tank made proposals as to how we can take small little steps to achieve universal suffrage. The first thing we need to do is to reform these rotten boroughs known as functional constituencies and make their representativeness much wider in terms of its constituents. And you can easily do that. There is nothing in the basic law, nothing in the interpretation handed down by the Standing Committee that would prevent this. And yet, the SAR government is simply unwilling to move on this. And Carrie also needs to dispel this notion, because in Hong Kong, there's a growing perception that the government is in cahoots with big business and is simply there to protect big business interests. There's a certain degree of that. But in the case of, for example, of affordable housing, we all know that the problem that we're in today is not because there is a shortage of land, but because the government is so afraid and lacks the political will to move again, very entrenched and strong narrow vested interests on the part of the 4 or 5 very big property companies that dominate the entire property scene in Hong Kong. It's hardly a free market.
In the far back, please.
Thanks very much. My name is Manik Mehta. I have a question in regard to Taiwan. How do you see the events happening in Hong Kong reflect on China's attitude to Taiwan, and conversely, from Taiwan to China?
I think Taiwan has already made it clear that one country, two systems is not for them, particularly seeing what has happened to the promises that Beijing solemnly made to Hong Kong people. I think within China, my reading is that the leadership have given up on, as it were, persuading Taiwan to return to the fold and to the motherland in the near future. I think the Taiwan problem is probably something that only time will resolve. But of late, I have heard, I don't know with what accuracy, that, and I think, Tsai Ing-wen needs to think about what policy she's going to adopt, because she's caught between a rock and a hard place. She needs to be seen to be on the side of her own party in not moving away for independence, and yet she knows independence invites the wrath of China, which it is quite prepared to show by all sorts of sanctions that it's currently adopting towards Taiwan. Okay? But of late in Hong Kong, there seems to be a view that China is losing patience, and I hope it's not true, and I don't think, yes, that maybe in a few years down the road, China does not rule out the possibility of taking Taiwan by force. Whether that will come to pass and what reaction it will enlist from this country and from other countries, I don't know. But there is, in Hong Kong, Hong Kong people, particularly our young people, they admire the democratic system and the way that they organize and go about elections in Taiwan. And there are frequent visits by politicians, by activists, to actually see for themselves every time there is an election, whether it's local election or legislative or election to the UN, to see what is going on the ground. And it really does fire up our younger people.
I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you, Anson. Kevin Rudd, President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. The operation of ICAC, Independent Commission Against Corruption, in Hong Kong is something which has been observed with admiration across Asia for many decades, in the period prior to 1997. Could you give us an update of the current operations of ICAC?
Yes.
And how does ICAC operate with the anti-corruption machinery, which is being deployed in Beijing against corruption right across China?
It's taken Hong Kong many years to establish the reputation which until very recently the Independent Commission Against Corruption enjoyed in Hong Kong. I think the then governor, Lord McElholz, took absolutely the right step in the mid-1970s to set up this body with draconian powers to fight what was at that time endemic corruption in Hong Kong. And we've been very successful. Okay? But recent happenings has caused concern. For example, the dismissal or the what is described as the voluntary leaving of a very senior ICAC deputy director who was forced out on common belief because she was probing into the money that the previous chief executive, Mr. C. Y. Leung, received from an Australian firm shortly before he took up office as a CEO. And there has also been disquieting noise about discontent at the senior level within the ICAC. I personally, I'm very familiar with that body. I used to be intimately involved with the running and with the picking of whoever hits this very, very important body. Important both for local consumption and for consumption overseas. Okay, that we no longer seem to be posting people of irreproachable integrity, who has the ability and the standing and credibility in the community to command respect. We seem now, almost as a matter of routine, to be filling some of our key posts, for example, the Commissioner of the ICAC, the Secretary for Security, with people drawn from the disciplined forces, particularly the Immigration Department. And there is a sign that the ICAC is being politicized, which is never a good thing for a body that is there to fight graft. So it bears very, very careful watching. But quite frankly, whoever is at the command at the top sets the tone. But I don't have confidence that the Commissioner of ICAC makes important decisions entirely on his own. Nor, I'm afraid, do I have too much confidence in the current Secretary for Security. So that doesn't augur well. And yet, we cannot afford for endemic corruption to crop back again. Fortunately, I have to say there are no signs of this. I think by and large, the public is still very, very alert. But it is a telling fact that the number of reports or allegations of corruption to the ICAC has fallen in recent years. So it's something that the government should, watch very carefully about and be seen in the eyes of the Hong Kong public to be doing the right thing. Because so much rests on that reputation.
So I think we've gone through our allotted time. I'd like to offer thanks, though, first to the Asia Society for remaining an open platform for discussions of this kind. It's very important that such institutions exist, and we're grateful that the Asia Society is in that vanguard. And of course, we'd like to thank Anson Chan for a blunt, not terribly diplomatic, realistic talk, and yet I think you left us with some optimism, perhaps largely based on the fact that we have seen your performance, and we know that Hong Kong has such an effective, experienced, and persuasive spokesperson.
Well, I am an eternal optimist. Thank you very much. And thank you, Asia Society, for giving me this platform. And thank you all for coming.